For millions of working Americans, the Industrial Revolution and the rise of big business led to a number of changes in America, and not all for the better. What were these changes? Number one, the nature of work changed. Many people went from working on farms to working in factories, and many went from working for themselves to working for somebody else. Second, who was doing the work changed. Women, children, African Americans, and new immigrants all joined the paid labor force, which oftentimes meant there were too many workers and wages were very low. Third, the United States went from being mostly rural society to a growing urban society as hundreds of thousands of people poured into the city where many of these new factory jobs were located. This overcrowding led to many health problems as diseases such as typhoid, cholera, and yellow fever spread. And finally, the industrial period led to a rise of political corruption and political machines. First, let's look at how the industrial period and big business changed the very nature of people's daily work. Previously, they might have worked for themselves at home, in a small shop, or outdoors, crafting raw materials into products or growing a crop from seed to table. When they took factory jobs, they were working for large companies. The repetitive work often involved only one small step in the manufacturing process, so the worker did not see or appreciate what was being made. The work was often dangerous and performed in unsanitary conditions. No longer producers, who like farmers and craftsmen were paid according to the quality of what they produce, industrial workers instead were becoming wage earners who worked when someone hired and paid them. In mass production, tasks were regulated by the clock and carefully supervised. As a Massachusetts factory testified in 1879, during working hours, the men were not allowed to speak to each other, though working close together on pain of discharge. Industrial accidents occurred often, killing hundreds of thousands each year. For those with mangled limbs and chronic illnesses, there was no disability insurance to replace lost income, and families suffered. As managers de-skilled production, the ranks of factory workers came to include more and more women and children who were almost always unskilled and low paid. Men often resented women's presence in factories, and male labor unions often worked to exclude women, especially wives, who they argued should remain in the home. Women vigorously defended their right to work. In 1900, 1 of every 5 children under the age of 16 worked outside the home. Child labor was most widespread in the South, where a low-wage industrial sector emerged after Reconstruction. Textile mills sprouted in the Carolinas and Georgia, recruiting workers from surrounding farms. Whole families often worked in the mills. Many children also worked in Pennsylvania coal fields, where death and injury rates were high. State law permitted children as young as 12 to labor with a family member, but turn-of-the-century investigators estimated that about 10,000 additional boys at even younger ages were illegally employed in the mines. Also at the bottom of the pay scale were African Americans. Corporations and industrial manufacturers widely discriminated against them on the basis of race, and such prejudice was hardly limited to the South. After the Civil War, African American women who moved to northern cities were largely barred from office work and other new employment options. Instead, they remained heavily concentrated in domestic service, with more than half employed as cooks or servants. African American men confronted similar exclusion. America's booming, vertically integrated corporations turned black men away from all but the most menial jobs. In 1890, almost a third of black men worked in personal service. Employers in the North and West recruited instead a different kind of low-wage labor, newly arrived immigrants. I'll discuss these new immigrants in a separate lecture, and we'll explore in more detail why these immigrants came to the United States, where they came from, what type of jobs they took, and how they lived. But suffice it to say, immigrants made an ideal labor supply. They took the worst jobs at low pay, and as a result, they generally lived in urban slums. And with the Industrial Revolution, their arrival in huge numbers helped transition the United States from a rural to an urban society. Between 1870 and 1920, the number of Americans in cities increased from 10 million to 54 million, and the number of places with more than 100,000 people swelled from 15 to 64. Journalist Jacob Riis captured the conditions that many immigrants lived in his famous 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives. As you can see from some of these photos that Riis published in the book, New York's immigrant communities lived in deplorable conditions of slum housing. Through these harrowing images of tenements and alleyways, Riis helped expose the reality of squalid living and working conditions faced by the inhabitants, and he set in motion an activist legacy linking photojournalism with reform. The confusion sounding urban management and the arrival of large numbers of immigrants who were desperate for work gave rise to political machines, organizations seeking to obtain and retain power. Machine politicians used fraud and bribery, but they also provided relief and service to their voters. Big cities were typically run by political machines, with the most notable in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Run by bosses, these organizations built power bases among immigrant working classes. Bosses understood people's problems from first-hand experience. Bosses made politics their full-time profession. They attended weddings and wakes, sponsored picnics, and held open houses and saloons where neighborhood folk could speak to them. In return for jobs, food, clothing, and intervention when someone got arrested, people gave machine politicians the votes that kept them in power. To finance their activities, bosses used political influence to control the awarding of public contracts. Recipients repaid the machine with a portion of the profits or salaries. Critics called this graft, but bosses called it gratitude. Though waste and corruption were often involved, machine-led governments constructed much of the new urban infrastructure, public buildings, sewer systems, schools, and streetcar lines, and expanded service such as firefighting, police, and public health. Bribes and kickbacks made machine projects costly. Bosses financed expansion with municipal bonds, and public debts soared. Also, payoffs from gambling and illegal liquor traffic were important sources of machine revenue. But bosses likely were no guiltier of greed and discrimination than businessmen who exploited workers, spoiled the environment, and manipulated government. Perhaps the most notorious political machine was right here in New York City with the establishment of Tammany Hall, a name that became synonymous with political corruption. The Tammany Hall ring of boss William Tweed, seen here, may have stolen more money from taxpayers than all the federal agencies combined. But Tammany forces would govern the city roughly from 1850 to 1930, when Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, backed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, sharply reduced the power and influence of Tammany Hall. Middle-class reformers condemned immigrants for supporting machines, but urban immigrants believed that few middle-class Americans cared about the plight of poor city folk like themselves. Machines were hardly perfect, but immigrants could rely on them for jobs, emergency aid, and the only public services they could hope to obtain. Well, how to fix these problems created by industrialization? Many workers who were angry about the dangerous working conditions, long hours, low wages, and child labor decided to join labor unions, who used their leverage of not working or striking to advocate for better conditions. In the decades after the Civil War, workers organized strikes and work stoppages that helped to publicize their problems. We discussed the Homestead strike in part 1, but Homestead was just one of many significant labor upheavals. Another was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Wage cuts in the railroad industry led to the strike, which began in West Virginia and spread to 3 additional states over a period of 45 days before being violently ended by a combination of vigilantes, National Guardsmen, and federal troops. In 1894, employees at the Pullman Palace Car Company, maker of railroad passenger cars, walked out over exploitative policies at the company town near Chicago. The owner, George Pullman, controlled nearly everything in the town of 12,000: land, buildings, school, banks, and rents. When he cut wages without reducing rents, the American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, went on strike. Pullman closed the factory, and the union refused to handle Pullman cars attached to any train. The Railroad Owners Association enlisted aid from the federal government, and Debs was arrested for defying a court injunction against the strike. President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops to Chicago. The union ended the strike, and Debs received a 6-month prison sentence. In 1905, radical laborers formed the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, who tried to unite unskilled workers, embracing violent tactics and socialism's rhetoric of class conflict. The Wobblies, as members of the IWW were often called, believed workers should seize and run the nation's industries. Beyond unions, there was also a growing movement to prohibit monopolies and regulate business. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act that made illegal every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in the restraint of trade. Those convicted of violating the law faced fines and jail terms, and victims could sue for triple damages. However, the law, under influence from pro-business Eastern senators, did not clearly define restraint of trade and left interpretation of its provisions to the pro-business courts. When in 1895 the federal government prosecuted the Sugar Trust for owning 98% of the nation's sugar refining capacity, 8 of 9 Supreme Court justices ruled in the landmark decision U.S. v. E.C. Knight Company that control of sugar manufacturing did not necessarily mean control of trade. Between 1890 and 1900, the federal government prosecuted only 18 cases under the Sherman Antitrust Act, mostly against railroads. Ironically, the act equipped the government to break up labor unions, which, when they went on strike, were deemed in restraint of trade. Thus, by the end of the 19th century, there were myriad problems created by industrialization that needed to be addressed. Progressive reformers emerged at the turn of the century to deal with these problems and who sought to end the abuse of power, protect the welfare of all classes, reform institutions, and promote social efficiency. Progressivism began as a social movement, but it grew into a political movement that would shape the national discourse for much of the next 30 years. We'll discuss the progressive movement in more detail next week.